If you've been on the internet at all lately, you've probably seen trailers for the new Bumblebee movie going around. And while my thoughts on that are conflicted, and I plan to talk about them soon, I think now is as good of an opportunity as ever to talk about the evolution of the Transformers franchise as a whole. Starting in the 80s, this absolutely unavoidable brand has pretty much shaped culture as we know it. The original Transformers TV show, which I'm sure everybody has seen or seen parodied at some point, essentially encapsulated an entire era of television entertainment. The 80s was a wild decade for TV shows and marketing. Private companies were allowed to put basically anything they wanted on kids' programming, leading to some very sly and very effective ad campaigns brutally attacking the fragile youth. The Children's Television Act wouldn't even be considered until the 90s, letting the gluttonous toy industry take full advantage of their freedom. Transformers was basically a cornerstone of this movement. A variety of unique and bizarre TV shows would parade around and compete for kids' attentions during this time, but I can't say that any of them has had as severe of an impact as Transformers. Transformers just had something about it. Maybe it was the premise, the characters, or just the way the entire thing was executed, but it was definitely memorable. It was literally a cultural icon. Now, don't get me wrong, it was just as bad as any other 80s show, and as much as I may admittedly enjoy it, it was god-awful. But something about it definitely stuck around, longer and more thoroughly than anything like Voltron or He-Man. No offense to either of those properties. And while you may be saying that both of these have seen media revivals as well, it's really not fair in the slightest to compare that to the type of attention that Transformers has. Transformers has seen multiple reboots and spin-offs, and I'm not just talking about one or two and maybe a few comics, I'm talking, well, a lot. I'm sure all of you remember the live-action Michael Bay movies, and probably even saw a few. Did you know there were 5 of them? I only know because I know too much about Transformers, but I can tell you that I stopped watching them a long time ago. It may sound like I'm nothing but critical of the series, and yeah, I do have a sort of love-hate relationship with it, but I want you to believe me when I say that it's not all terrible. It's actually kind of amazing how much of our lives and personalities are affected by our childhood nostalgia. We are almost completely controlled by our child's securities. It's just comforting to take part in those familiar activities because mentally it's your only real defense from the existential danger of adult life and thinking. It's why you always hear people talking about how much better things were back in their days, from baby boomers in the 50s and 60s all the way up to the top 15 things only 90s kids will remember. I mean, I know I'm totally a 2000s kid. I love everything to do with the 2000s internet, MySpace, and early YouTube and Flash games and awful parodies. God, I'm getting emotional just thinking about how terrible it all was. Even though the original Transformers was probably a complete waste of time, it was a huge part of many people's childhoods. And despite the fact that the old boys back at Hasbro were Ben Shapiro and didn't care about your feelings, that didn't stop people from developing connections with the media. The world and characters and pretty much everything about the show would inevitably become huge inspirations for an entire generation of people and probably many after. They say you can't polish a turd, but I have to say I kinda disagree, because when it comes to stuff like Transformers, you totally can. All it takes is a bit of passion and blind faith, and you can make something good out of it. And this is why I adore Transformers Prime. Now, to back up, let's talk about a slightly less obvious continuation of the Transformers franchise. Aside from the movies, there have been a variety of independent reboot shows created over the years, although I have to say, unfortunately, a few of them ever maintained quite the same level of popularity as their cinematic counterparts. To date, there have been 23 of these. I didn't even know some of these existed. Transformers Go? What the hell is Transformers Go? Apparently it's exclusively Japanese, which is kind of a bummer. I was hoping this was some obscure, really awful show I could discuss someday. The point is, there are a lot of them, and they've all kind of fallen to the wayside. And while I will agree that most of them are as bad as you would expect, there were actually some surprisingly good ones. Well, maybe 3 or 4. While each of these has its good individual qualities, I have to focus your attention on Transformers Prime. Now, chances are you've heard of the show somewhere before, but let me just say it right now. This show doesn't get nearly the amount of attention it deserves. I've never been able to get into the Transformers comics or many other of the franchise's offshoots, but Transformers Prime is just different. It's actually kind of a tragic story. So Hasbro had this idea for a vast expanded universe of Marvel-level proportions, and they sort of dumped it all on the showrunners, who were really of a different speed. The showrunners and cast were super ambitious and genuinely passionate about the show, putting in so much care and attention, and ultimately a lot of over-budget money and time, into making sure it was everything they wanted in a Transformers series. They even apparently incorporated certain ideas in the show from their experiences playing with the toys as children. I mean, that's probably the most precious thing I've ever heard. However, the team and Hasbro disagreed creatively on several levels, with this ultimately leading to the show getting unnecessarily restricted and, by the third season, suffering noticeably. It was an uphill battle between creator and commissioner, and in a lot of ways, I think that Transformers Prime was truly a martyr for the franchise. It's definitely not perfect, but it has so much heart poured into it that I for sure wish it could have had the opportunity to be. The show is artistically beautiful, with each one of the designs being absolutely filled with so much character and individuality that they're to this day some of my most prominent creative muses. The story and themes are equally as complex, however stifled as some of them can be. Again, creative differences in aim and demographic forced the showrunners to be creative with what they wanted to display. Of all the Transformers series I've seen, Prime tackles themes of personal struggles, war, and the messier details of good and evil with so much more nuance and maturity. And so much of it is just sort of left in the air, too. It really forces you to think a little more deeply about what's going on and who's involved. There are infinite possibilities for every single character and interaction, and I find great joy in just sitting down and trying to make sense of it all. Maybe I'm just some crazy person, but there is something about this show that I can't get out of my head. It's really difficult to explain. It's an idea that I've been sitting on, revisiting, and rethinking for the better half of the last 3 or 4 years that I've been invested in this show and Transformers as a whole. And while this entire concept is much more universal than just Transformers, I think that in a way it is perfectly encompassed by one individual component of the show. A story beat you could honestly miss in a blink per se, which is so much more relevant to the story than anyone would think, and says so much more than it rightfully should. There is one element about Transformers Prime which I think truly captures its essence and potential, greatness and sheer profoundness. It's what really provoked me to start thinking about this show. Honestly, it's what really attached me to the story in the first place. And by one element, I actually mean two. And by two elements, I mean Megatron and Starscream, and their relationship. This is why Megatron and Starscream matter. I know that this entire subject might sound a bit ridiculous, and if anything, maybe even underwhelming. I mean, come on, it's Transformers. That's pretty interesting. You're going to bring up Transformers and all you're going to talk about is some relationship drama? And to that, I have to agree. My intent with this video, however, isn't to suggest that Transformers is, or even should be, some elaborate and inconvenient story about stupidly sappy romance or fanfiction fuel. We have the comics for that. I don't want to swindle or upset you by formulating perversions out of your childhood icons. All I want you to take away from this video is, hopefully, an interesting speculation. It's all based on my personal experience, and if yours is different, I completely respect that. But without further ado, let's talk about robots. Transformers Prime does something really interesting with its antagonists, the classic Decepticons. Although most other incarnations of the franchise have characterized villains, I rarely see it to the same extent as Prime, establishing them as not only enemies, but enemies with dilemmas and personal struggles. The cast of each side is incredibly limited, indicating that there are only a select few Transformers left in the universe. This rather bleak statement of finality makes the individuals all the more precious and important. While I think that each Decepticon represents a unique struggle of sorts, and that the same could be said for the entirety of their movement, few intrigue me more than Megatron and Starscream. I should preface this a little. You all are probably familiar with the pair. Megatron, certainly. He's unforgettable, if only for the fact that his personality is whatever the genre and tone of the show he's in requires it to be. He's a bit of a blank slate. Starscream is a bit more defined, but maybe less notorious. For the few of you who somehow don't remember, he is the second in command of the Decepticons who has few drives in life aside from betraying Megatron. They're a nuclear combo, often played for comedy or plot convenience. On the surface, it may seem like Prime is no different, but I have to encourage you to stop and look closer. No, I mean, literally just look at them. Look at their designs. As I mentioned before, I love these designs. In the case of Megatron and Starscream, they clearly have a lot of visual parallels. Certain unique aspects of design are closely mirrored between them, for example, the brow pieces and color palettes. Megatron and Starscream are the only characters with silvery grays as their predominant colors, and while there are disparities between them, muting Starscream's flashy reds and blues to a much calmer but still uniquely distinct design is an important decision in forging him. Structurally, however, the two of them are vastly different. Megatron is a big boy with a proud and menacing posture, broad shoulders, and tiny hips. Starscream is much more reserved and delicate, far smaller in stature and clearly sneaky in the way he stands. He has a very small waist and very thick thighs. I mean, Jesus, have you seen this? That leads to another important contrast between Starscream and Megatron: engendering principles. Megatron is very stereotypically masculine, idealized in the traditional dominant image. While Starscream is definitely cowardly and submissive, these traits are not necessarily portrayed in his design to be mocking of his emasculate nature. Instead of de-emphasizing his masculinity, the designers drew extra attention to his femininity. Though hunched and cautious, Starscream is demonstrated to be very graceful. Many aspects of him are smaller and more closely resembling the typical femme, from the softening of his face as episodes pass to his obviously long and slender legs. And just look at those little heels! He's just got little tiny stilettos! Compared to Arachnid and Arcee, two canonically female Transformers, Starscream's thighs are fuller, and his feet are much closer in shape to Arachnid's than someone like Knockouts. A lot of Starscream's proportions are opposite to Megatron's, emphasizing the feminine to masculine dynamic. Literally, have you seen Megatron's feet? Starscream could probably stand on one of his toes. I love them. So why is Starscream so unusually feminine for a male character? Is the purpose to imply that feminine characters are subservient, thus why Starscream is perpetually second in command? Well, I'm not gonna tell you what you can and can't think about femoids, but in the context of Starscream, while I do think that the power balance implied between him and Megatron has to do with their gendered contrast, in a lot of ways I think that Starscream's more traditionally feminine side plays a big part towards his advantage over Megatron. The two characters each possess their own benefits and ability. Megatron is very evidently a powerhouse over the meek and wry Starscream, but Starscream is charming and takes a much more intimate approach to demonstrating his dominance. Megatron is emotionally distant, while Starscream is shown multiple times throughout the course of the show to thrive on the emotional responses of others, using manipulative tactics to get what he wants. Both characters hold a power over each other associated with their respective gendered titles. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that all men are emotionally bankrupt and all women are inherently mischievous, and I don't think that the show is either, since it has a cast of characters who don't appeal to those stereotypes. But I want you to put a pin in the way that Megatron and Starscream represent extreme and contradicting gender norms. I'm pretty sure that's all I really need to say about Starscream's appearance. Megatron design in and of itself has a lot to unpack as well, but I want you to hold that thought and I promise I'll come back to it later. Momentarily, I think it's appropriate that we finally start putting this all into context. In case you missed the spoiler warning at the beginning, I'm going to be discussing a wide range of relevant plots and events to the show, so if you don't want any of that ruined for you, then just don't watch the rest of this video. Sorry. Megatron and Starscream are relevant characters throughout the series, so it's fitting, I believe, to start at the very beginning. Transformers Prime kicks off with a 5-part sequence of episodes referred to as Darkness Rising, where the characters are introduced, and this, of course, includes our subjects. Starscream is the Decepticon second in command who has obtained the rank of temporary leader while Megatron is away in space looking for troops. This is an interesting preface. At this point in the show, the only two real Decepticons, and by this I mean excluding the Eraticons, a race of disposable manufactured clones employed under Megatron, are Starscream and Soundwave. Immediately, the choice to introduce the Decepticons as a broken unit, which hardly seems capable of acting as a military base, is important. Starscream is immediately framed as an essential villain character, as the first death in the series, and incredibly well executed one at that, is made by his hand. Honestly, I can't get over how good the opening to the show is. Every convention of a classic lone wolf hero is shown in Cliffjumper, only to be abruptly sabotaged by the unexpected, a gory, on-screen murder, effectively setting the highs and lows of Prime's tone for the rest of the show. This is also an important moment in the way that it introduces Starscream. Due to the fact that, excluding Eraticons, Prime's cast is very limited, each death is incredibly important. Take notes on this because it's going to bite you in the butt later. The villain which steps up and takes the reins, single-handedly kicking off the series and twisting the viewer's expectations, isn't Megatron, the leader of the Decepticons, it's Starscream. And he doesn't overpower Cliffjumper physically. They don't have some impressive fight where Starscream fairly gets the better of him. His termination is abrupt and underhanded. No matter how obvious it seems to assume that Starscream is a comic relief character, the single introductory scene completely nullifies that assumption. Starscream is very important. At the end of Part 1, Megatron returns from his celestial voyage, and their interactions are fairly cold. Megatron returns bearing a substance known as Dark Energon, which has the power to revive the dead. Cliffjumper's corpse from earlier obviously is put back into use. Dark Energon is a powerful substance with the ability to give life to the inanimate only in its most chilling primal form. While this application on its own is interesting enough, Megatron's use of it is perhaps even more so. With reckless abandon, in the very second episode, Megatron stabs himself with the Dark Energon shard. Immediately, Megatron is an interesting mech. The first thing we learn about him is that he seems to possess little to no care for his personal welfare, and his main goal, unsurprisingly, is achieving power. But his entire attitude just seems off. His disregard and apathy, his fixation, and simply the fact that he, the leader of the Decepticons, the single most important component of the entire Decepticon army, went on an expedition through space spanning multiple years, just makes his actions and responses seem strange. It's hinted somewhat that he's not in his right state of mind, and while I don't necessarily think he is completely there, Megatron is undoubtedly high-functioning. He is smart and fairly stable, though the Dark Energon has an entire expedition with that will bring out an erratic behavior far worse than virtually anything else we see from him across the course of the show. Clearly, not everything is right here. We've got a Decepticon army of 3, composed of Soundwave, who never speaks, Starscream, a patient and brutal plotter, and finally Megatron, the Decepticon leader who treats his position with disregard and abandon. It's a very strange way to present your enemy faction who, while always beatable, is supposed to dwarf the rival protagonists in size and abilities. The numbers of the Decepticons are inflated with highly disposable Eraticons, and the leader, Megatron, seems almost shy of his responsibility. He's a menacing figure, but there's just something about him that isn't quite right. So Megatron experiments with the powers of Dark Energon and plans to use it through himself to reanimate and control an entire army of fallen Decepticon soldiers back on Cybertron. To spare the details, it backfires, thus ending the 5-parter and beginning the first major villain story of the series. Megatron is left alive, but only barely, thanks in most part to the Dark Energon. But Starscream, being Starscream, wastes no time in taking advantage of this situation. The scene which plays out is certainly an important one. It's really the first personal moment we see between the two, and it definitely doesn't disappoint. The shot we get is a very intimate interaction between Starscream and the unconscious Megatron, and I mean that literally. Starscream is actually on top of him. Like, seriously. Disregarding the physical tension, the scene sets up a dynamic they're going to have excellently. The tantalizing closeness Starscream assumes in Megatron's most vulnerable state, the confidence Starscream has, the isolation of anything other than themselves. All of these elements come together under the uniting factor of Dark Energon, the moment finally coming to a head when Starscream removes a fragment of Energon from his chest, Megatron gives him a brief scare, and finally Starscream distances himself from the warlord in a very symbolic separation. Soundwave's surveillance drone Laserbeak manages to catch all of this happening, forcing Starscream to rescue the useless Megatron in fear of being reprimanded for his disgrace to the throne, and leaving Megatron to exist in a comatose state over a decent chunk of the series. It's an unusual introduction to the Decepticon hierarchy to have the main antagonist be compromised by a lesser villain so early on in the show, but this dynamic is very important. Megatron overcomes impossible odds, fighting face-to-face with his bitter nemesis Optimus Prime and nearly getting the upper hand, surviving almost certain death, but the one thing he fails to counteract is Starscream. Left at his weakest point, but still clinging on, persistent as Megatron is, Starscream is the one who has the final say in whether or not he lives or dies, and this is a necessary observation. Regardless of what transpired in that fleeting moment, Megatron is inevitably restored, as is Starscream's lowly position. One fleeting arc is done and over with, only to be substituted with the status quo. It's not until Season 1, Episode 19, Rock Bottom, that the next majorly significant piece of defining action occurs. Let me just preface this by saying that Rock Bottom is one of my favorite episodes. It's pretty mundane and tame compared to a lot of the others, but I can watch Rock Bottom indefinitely. Up until this point, over halfway into Season 1, most of the interactions and conflicts between Megatron and Starscream have been for the purpose of establishment. We haven't seen them interact too much, but we know what relevancy they have to one another. From everything we've seen, Megatron and Starscream are an unhealthy combo. Each one has a bitter reservation against the other, and clearly neither is benefiting from each other's cause. I mean, Starscream's cause is inherently based around the idea of Megatron not existing. Megatron's character motivations, however, are a bit more complex. His domineering attitude doesn't stem from a single negative characteristic, or at least they don't come off as if they do, as in the case with Starscream. I suppose one could make the claim that he does have a determining trait, and that trait is being evil, but he isn't. Not really. Megatron may have started out as a vicious, overtly ambitious gladiator, just about as violent and crude in the pre-war saga as he was following Declaration, but he had a very wholesome goal: abolishing the caste system and becoming a prime so he could make things better for everyone. Megatron was, in every aspect, a self-made leader. He clawed himself out of the literal pits of Chaos, ordered his way around to higher authorities until he made it to the Council of Primes, which inevitably denied him, turning their attention to Optimus. As wholesome and wise as Optimus might appear, he didn't really earn it. He was given the Matrix to keep it out of Megatron's grasp, and ultimately all of the positive qualities he retained were not even byproducts of his own experiences. He's a conglomeration of the minds and experiences of past primes, representing the unattainable wealth of all good values which are inherently bestowed, not learned. Megatron is an underdog in this situation. He got himself to this point entirely of his own accord, and now he possesses the capability to stand up to and defeat a prime, possibly one of the most powerful beings in the universe. In a lot of ways, Megatron's motives and ambitions are truly admirable. So what caused him to turn so evil? The first situation I will cite is one of his individual passion. Megatron, as selfless as he is, attaches himself firmly to his goals and ideals. The Matrix, and becoming Prime, when taken away from him, become less of a harbinger of reform and morality and more of a personal loss, something he developed a true love for and which was unjustifiably stolen from him. This was the first time Megatron betrayed his goal for something he was passionate for. The second issue, which I think will lead to the Warlord's demise in the moral aspect, is his status as an underdog. Megatron, again, is entirely self-made, and even in his menacing final form, he's really much less formidable than he's perceived to be by others. The evil persona Megatron has is not a reflection of his true self, but instead a lie told in hopes of staying afloat, an identity skillfully crafted in everything from the Decepticon name to Megatron's formidable appearance. The philosophy of this morally reprehensible role-playing game is that the ends will inevitably justify the means, and Megatron has made it clear that he will do anything at the expense of protecting and ensuring what he loves. So returning to Starscream, the Seeker is very obviously a threat to all of these things. As will be demonstrated soon, Megatron wastes no time eliminating stragglers and mess-ups, so what is it that protects Starscream from all of this, when he is very clearly a threat to Megatron's very ideology? Well, this issue begins to be addressed in Rock Bottom. In this episode, two plot points, one occurring between the Autobots and their human companions, and the other between Starscream and Megatron, eventually cross over with one another. The only real important thing about the humans is that they're there, so I'll skip the details of that party and graduate to discussing the real meat of the situation: Megatron and Starscream. The catalyst of their interaction is simple. Megatron approaches Starscream to confront him directly about his disloyalties, aiming to kill him in the most satisfying fashion possible. Or is it? Megatron's behavior in this episode is rather interesting. He's very firm and certain when he tells Starscream about how much he anticipates killing him, but the final blow falters, and it almost seems as if the purpose of this outing wasn't to dispose of Starscream at all. Megatron certainly seems hesitant. For a mech who acts quickly and with disregard for his own personal safety, or quite frankly the safety of others, he is surprisingly indecisive. Nonetheless, the situation goes awry and Starscream momentarily escapes, leaving Megatron stranded. Again, Megatron is taken advantage of by Starscream. The theme of Rock Bottom for Megatron and Starscream seems to be making decisions. Megatron is given the task of deciding how to deal with Starscream and whether or not he is capable. Starscream has to decide whether he ought to leave Megatron for dead or return to save him. While each of the choices they make in between is important individually, I think that the single most valuable choice Megatron makes is this. He recognizes Starscream as a harmful influence, but chooses, instead of killing him for the sake of his own health and the health of the cause, to foster this delusional idea that his ambitions and Starscream's can somehow coexist. But why is Megatron doing this? Rock Bottom may not have the answers, but it certainly has the keys. And those keys lead right along to Season 1, Episode 20, Partners. It's clear to see how Rock Bottom and Partners play off of each other. The back-to-back episodes don't waste any time in picking off where we started, continuing the running motif of making decisions as Starscream, following an unfavorable collaboration with Arachnid, flip-flops between being resigned to his fate and yearning for something greater. His alliances are even called into question when he proposes joining the Autobots. This episode focuses heavily on Starscream, having the opening and ending scenes narrated by his surprisingly serious monologue. If Rock Bottom was an insight into Megatron's dilemma, Partners characterizes Starscream. In this episode, Starscream is possibly at his most truly vulnerable. It's the first time where we see him really questioning his goals and trying to make true sense of his emotions. Even now, only in Season 1, Starscream questions his self-fulfilled role, wondering what it's worth for him to persist in an unfulfilling game. Like Megatron, Starscream has a fabricated identity for himself, and he is starting to drift away from the beaten path. The status quo has barely seen the opportunity to be established before Megatron and Starscream challenge it. There's another important character discourse in Partners, and it relates back to Megatron. When Starscream goes missing, Megatron's response is defensive and reactionary. He treats Starscream's disappearance as a very serious matter. Now this is definitely unusual. When Breakdown goes MIA after being captured by Mech and ends up losing his eye, Megatron is cold and unfeeling, completely lacking sympathy for his dilemma, and implying that if Breakdown was to die, it would be his own fault and they wouldn't need the assistance of a weak Mech. Breakdown, despite being an effective and important military unit, one of his very few, is willingly ignored and abandoned. While one could make the argument that Starscream is a second in command and that the position is far more important, this brings into question the necessity of appointing Starscream to such a position at all. In Rock Bottom, Megatron says that the only reason he keeps Starscream around is for entertainment. This is a very essential statement, so keep that in the back of your head. When later in the series Breakdown is actually killed by Arachnid, the same Decepticon who Starscream was accompanied by before he took off, Megatron's reaction is, again, unsympathetic. Starscream does not return to the Decepticons until late into Season 2. In between, we do get an episode where Megatron ends up killing some of Starscream's clones, but aside from this, the two of them get very little interaction. Starscream's lesson learned in his separation is simple, that he simply can't survive without Megatron, having independently lost his ability to transform, and although he experiences the occasional instance of favorable luck, it is clear as the arc draws to a close that Starscream's confidence has been worn away. He's ready to go back to the Decepticons and to continue the cycle of mutual abuse. Starscream and Megatron finally reunite in Season 2, Episode 24, Patch. Patch is an episode entirely dedicated to reflecting on and repairing the duo's relationship, so one could correctly assume that it kickstarts a series of very important events. Starscream returns to the Decepticons bearing the gift of the Omega Keys, which serve an important purpose in the season finale. However, Megatron, rightfully incapable of trusting him, has Starscream engage with him in a curious strategy. He uses the cortical psychic patch to enter Starscream's consciousness so that they may communicate on a more personal field. The most important thing to take away from this is the fact that Megatron accepts Starscream, citing his reasoning to be that Starscream is far too valuable to lose. Now this is a very different excuse to the one presented in Rock Bottom. Despite the fact that between them, Megatron and Starscream have not interacted, Megatron has gone from gaudily claiming that Starscream is barely even entertaining to suddenly insisting that he is far too important to lose. Why would he do this? Starscream may have brought him the Omega Keys, but he's virtually flightless, and if anything, his restored presence would only cause disorder and controversy among the likes of Dreadwing. As a leader, everything Megatron does is either to further his own cause or to gain and maintain power. Everything about his and Starscream's relationship detracts from it. Instead of doing what's probably smarter and getting rid of Starscream while he has the opportunity, Megatron makes one final choice which cements the pair's fate and brings this phase of the relationship to a close. So I alluded to Dreadwing, who is the brother of Skyquake. Skyquake was a mech who died in part thanks to Starscream at the beginning of Season 1. Dreadwing and Skyquake both exemplify unwavering loyalty and support. Skyquake refused to follow Starscream's orders because his dedication lied with Megatron, and Dreadwing is completely modeled in every aspect of his service to the Decepticon army, only being called into question when he favors the honor of his brother over Megatron's will. Dreadwing is an ideal Decepticon troop whose only shortcoming is that he refuses to cooperate with Starscream. Inevitably, when he learns that Starscream will be returning to the warship, Dreadwing tries to kill him, which puts Megatron face to face with the situation he created, forcing him to address his mistakes. Why don't you just guess which of the two mechs Megatron kills because of their disobedience? I'll give you 3 seconds. Okay, it was Dreadwing. Oh, the complete and total irony of the situation. Dreadwing's death was sudden and unreasonable, and just thinking about what the logic must have been behind the situation really emphasizes this. Dreadwing has to die because he was disobeying Megatron's orders. Alright, but remember that he's defending Starscream. This is not even just a because I said so affair, it's completely hypocritical. Starscream is not a military advantage of any sort. Megatron's attachment to him isn't strategic. No, his interest in Starscream comes from something else. But enough about that, I really ought to wrap up this plot summary already. I have to say that I'm not the biggest fan of Season 3 of Transformers Prime, and I don't think the showrunners were either. From what I've read, Season 3 was where their creative differences with Hasbro eventually culminated, and I think it's kind of depressing to see how the show got very obviously derailed when it still had so much left it wanted to say. In spite of this, there is one element of the season that I actually enjoy a lot. In case you were having a hard time figuring it out, it's Megatron and Starscream. Fittingly, the final season sees them interact positively with each other. Yeah, what a surprise. Following Dreadwing's death, Starscream and Megatron seem to develop a new appreciation for each other, and briefly we see the two of them cooperate really well. Shockwave's entrance does end up causing a disruption, but in this case the conflict is caused by Starscream's jealousy. It's a strange shift of character for him, to see him go from acting independently and selfishly to suddenly see him motivated by a need for the attention and validation of somebody else. They do have some issues stemming from Starscream's feeling of neglect, but by the end of the series they've worked it out, and Prime closes off with Starscream feeling genuine remorse towards Megatron's death, giving the sense that the two of them have resolved their differences. I like to chronicle the relationship in 3 parts. The first is their exposition. From the Darkness Rising saga to Rock Bottom and Partners, we see Megatron and Starscream's dynamic laid out, revealing how they're supposed to feel for each other and the subtler nuances of their partnership. It begins with the perfect example of their strained ties, and ends with both of them calling into question the roles they're indefinitely destined to play. The second starts at Partners, and begins with their separation/redemption arc. Though their time to interact with each other is the least of all 3 acts, the change is perhaps the most dramatic. Megatron and Starscream seem to accept each other back into their lives, with the crumbling relationship reinvigorated by the unnecessary death of Dreadwing. And finally, the last part is their restoration. Megatron and Starscream come to forgive each other and work to build a better understanding. There were a few bumps in the road, but the outcome is clear. Megatron and Starscream work better together than they do apart. I like to view their development as if it ends here, instead of after the movie, since I think it is a fairly fitting way to close off their growth. So, Megatron and Starscream have a developed relationship. For what? What about this matters? And what does any of this even mean? Well, do you remember what I said about each character playing the part of a bigger symbolic motif? To see a perfect example of this, one must look no further than Megatron. Megatron, as I've said before, is an interesting character. Starting at his design, which I've already conceptually explained, the Warlord's stature and appearance gives good insight into who he is. His armor is clearly of Cybertronian origin, resembling no human aircraft or vehicle, accentuating the regality and angular nature of his build. There's definitely the sense of viciousness and dominance present in the way his character is structured. Perhaps one of the most notably menacing features of Megatron's design is his scarred face. The gruesomely blackened gashes draw attention to its gritty, evil nature. While other mechs might use paints and decals to adorn themselves, Megatron chooses instead to show off a relic of battle, passing up a glossy, impressive finish in favor of a much darker, more natural appearance. But is it natural, really? The scars are certainly garish enough to where most wouldn't give them a second thought. They're clearly war wounds, and the intent is clearly to flaunt them, perhaps as a reminder of betrayal or victory. They're a warning to Megatron's enemies of his strength and his unpredictable brutality. Except they really can't be, can they? If you look closely at the patterns of his scars, you'll realize that they don't trail off like jagged slashes. They are almost completely symmetrical. Each set of scars looks like it has been placed deliberately and intentionally. But they can't just be decorations, can they? The edges of the gashes are all blackened and grimy, so they must be wounds of some sort. If this is true, then how did they end up like this? Personally, I believe that in order to theorize and understand this strange design choice, it's important to reference back to the two driving factors of Megatron's character, which I laid out earlier. Megatron isn't simply evil because that's how he's always been. If he were always evil, then there would be no need to include a backstory between him and Optimus. Everything would just obviously be that way. But the betrayal of trust he witnesses by Orion is not nearly enough to turn him from a pioneer of civil justice into a plotting, nefarious mastermind who acknowledges himself as such. The way he considers himself evil is important. When it comes to a long-lasting ideology, very few people will just agree that their way of life is wrong and inherently despicable, yet still pursue it. Megatron had a beneficent goal in the beginning, and more likely than not, his supporters do too. So what turned them evil? I brought this up once before, but I'll say it again. They aren't. Evilness is just a role they play. The Decepticons don't truly think that they're in the wrong, although I'm sure that they relish in the opportunity to exaggerate for show. The intimidation and moral bankruptcy isn't true to their real beliefs. It's a shield. The Autobots started out on the right side. The Decepticons weren't the oppressive governing force. They are the Resistance. From the very beginning, when Megatron was denied access to the Matrix, he and his entire movement were underdogs. On his own, he had basically no chance of winning this fight. But then, he became Megatron. Violence, rioting, and unspeakable displays of brutality all elevated Megatron and his crew to something greater than adversaries. They were a frightening characterization of their enemies' worst fears. It strengthened them in the eyes of their opponents, turned them into more than just a rapscallion gang of misfits. Now, all of a sudden, they had an advantage. They were feared. This movement really, if you think about it, starts with Megatron. The scars are certainly frightening and menacing. It's a catalog of his change, of all the mechs he's fought and won over. Except that it isn't. The slashes are crude, but precise. It's as if somebody intentionally made them like that. And that's because somebody did. Megatron did. It's the embodiment of his sacrifice. Outwardly, and in action, he is tough and brutal, but this facade he bears is harder to maintain than it seems. As natural as it looks, there's just something off about his seemingly intolerant and evil persona. Megatron isn't evil, but he sure as hell wants to look that way. And that's why he's scarred himself. He's gone to the lengths of hurting and permanently damaging himself to reach this goal. His dedication is apparent. As much as the lie wounds him, he maintains it, because he has one goal in life and this is the only way he can achieve it. Besides, it's not like he has anything else to live for. It's not like he has any other loyalties. Right? This, in case it wasn't obvious, is where Starscream becomes important. Megatron isn't a mech who forms strong relationships. There are a few things he is passionate about, but when he is, as is evidenced by the way he reacted to losing the Matrix, Megatron is willing to sacrifice principles and his own livelihood to protect them. Power and justice are Megatron's passions, and even though his methods of obtaining them may seem immoral or dangerous, he's willing to pursue them for the purpose of succeeding. The things Megatron is passionate about are the things he's willing to make sacrifices for. Even though Orion Pax and Megatron were supposedly friends, when Megatron perceived that Orion had betrayed him, even though what Orion had done was not even his fault, Megatron made him his sworn enemy. Again, Megatron's passion and cause has always been more important than anything else in his life. But throughout his run as a warlord, Megatron doesn't seem to be as strong-willed or dedicated as he once was. His attention is constantly divided, he's always making risky decisions, and if anything, he just seems tired with his responsibility. Perhaps Megatron is just getting old, or maybe he's gotten fed up of playing the bad guy and seeing no results. There are 1,000,001 possible explanations as to why he acts this way, but I think there's one in particular that not only ties this plot together quite solidly, but also works on an allegorical level as well as a narrative one. Megatron is not as dedicated to his job because he has a new passion. That passion is Starscream. The war effort and Starscream are two things which are inherently contradictory, because the Megatron can't really afford to win one without losing the other. Starscream is a dangerous distraction. While some of his takeover attempts may seem laughable, it's clear that Megatron dedicates energy and time to dealing with them. There were multiple episodes dedicated to this fact in the beginning of the series. It is clear that in some capacity, Starscream can stand up to Megatron, and this can have rather disastrous consequences. And yet Megatron, whose entire passion is eliminating the people that keep him from power, as he's been trying to do with Optimus for years, even though Optimus really didn't do anything to him, keeps Starscream around. It seems ridiculous. Megatron formed an incredibly hostile relationship with Orion after he got the Matrix unintentionally because he saw it as a threat to his power, but Starscream, who regularly threatens Megatron's life and has intentionally betrayed him far more than Optimus ever will, is, according to Megatron's words in the Season 3 episode Thirst, somebody he has offered more pardons and options for redemptions to than anyone else in his life. The Decepticons have based their entire identity around a set of principles and ideas, Megatron's ideas, and even with Cybertron destroyed, as well as over most of the Cybertronian population eliminated completely, they have not backed down or wavered. They kept fighting until they killed their own planet and most of their species. The war isn't going to end until somebody surrenders, and nobody has any intention to do so. You'd think that after all this time, Megatron would know better, and would be so fixated on finally bringing this conflict to a close that he wouldn't mind killing another mech to do it. And yet, he persistently stalls and drags his feet when it'll only lead to more debilitating death and internal threats. Somehow, Megatron finds it in himself to show some sort of compassion. The way Starscream and Megatron's conflict is introduced highlights the severity of this issue. Starscream is very clearly a problem which disables him from doing what he has to, but Megatron doesn't do anything to stop it. That's because he cares about Starscream more. It's kind of poetic. Megatron wants the thing he can't have and all that stuff, but it really is true. All throughout his life, Megatron's goals have been selfish and self-oriented. He has wanted to advance himself personally, and while this isn't a bad goal, the way Megatron decided to go about it was to be a power glutton and climb to the top as quickly as possible. He has always been looking to advance his own cause. For the first time in Megatron's life, there's something else that's held his interest. Somebody else. And even though Starscream is in every single way the antithesis to everything he's ever wanted, a demanding other half that constantly jeopardizes his success, he's sacrificed his well-being, his commanders, possibly even his own success in the military field to accommodate for Starscream and to keep him alive. As a mech who's based everything around acting selfish, even if for a theoretically unselfish goal, Megatron defies himself and his own character by quite frankly obsessing over a mech who stands to destroy all of it. Megatron is suddenly more lenient, more open to compassion, and if anything, he just seems to be slowly tiring of this endless war effort. Ultimately, Megatron's politics are very personal. Almost all politics are personal. Politics are founded almost entirely on balancing the happiness and safety of a group of people, and when you simplify that premise to a cast of about 5 or 6 individuals at a time per team, having each limb and ideal be summarized by the emotions of a single person, that really helps to better explain the nature of war. In order to reform himself and realize his efforts, Megatron needs to learn about personal compassion and forgiveness. Throughout his life, Megatron has never once been able to sustain a personal connection because he has never related to someone on that level, or because his illusions of grandeur prevented him from doing so. Without that understanding of personal love and care, he wasn't able to see the issue of taking his own abrasive evil persona and treating his soldiers like they were less than people. It's easy to see why Starscream has such a strong effect on him. Starscream and Megatron do work well together. We see that in the beginning of Season 3. What keeps them apart are their more selfish desires. They are drawn together through the span of the show, both physically and emotionally. While one could argue that there is no way that they could work together because they're mutually abusive, I'd say that the issue with them is that they aren't working together. Both of them feel like they have some sort of status quo to keep up where they're fighting each other for the upper hand, but neither of them seems to really want it. Megatron's leniency and excuses for Starscream speak clearly enough, and aside from that moment in Partners where Starscream questions his purpose and qualities, he's very quick to cooperate with Megatron after the Warlord shows him dedication and care enough to take him over Dreadwing. Starscream cares enough to be jealous of Shockwave when Megatron pays more attention to him. It really only takes the catalyst for the relationship to suddenly improve and tighten, and I don't think it's any coincidence that they were at possibly their peak in success and advantage during the Season 3 premiere, the first time we saw the two of them cooperating with wholehearted willingness. Maybe that was all they really needed in the end. Starscream learned about loyalty and cooperation, and Megatron learned to have a bit more trust and compassion, even in the face of, well, Starscream. And it did seem to work out for them, if not being short-lived. To conclude, I really do think that Starscream and Megatron represent an important character and ideology balance, which helps to flesh out the complications of this war and the political atmosphere surrounding it. Megatron and Starscream are both products of a selfish environment whose actions both lead to the situation we see them in today. Their selfishness is what keeps them from fully becoming righteous or complete characters, but once they merge their talents and learn to appreciate each other instead of jeopardizing one another, they work really well together. While it may not be exactly a commentary on the level of Fahrenheit 451, there's something essential and important to take away from this. Understanding people is important. Taking the time to learn what it's like to be friends or lovers on a personal level, and to find that mutually beneficial relationship is worth it. You don't want to end up alienating somebody you could learn from or grow positively with because you have a selfish goal, or because you're too caught up in being a martyr for your ideologies to stop and try to make amends with another individual. It's important to be open to forgiveness and accepting of other people, even when it seems like you're sworn enemies, because sometimes a misunderstanding is all it really takes to set people on the path of hurting each other. And that's why I think Starscream and Megatron's relationship matters. Thank you so much to everyone who stopped to watch this video. I know it was super long and dense and probably not a topic that everyone has a lot of interest in, but it really means a lot to me that you've got this far. This is a topic I'm admittedly kinda passionate about, and I love to have the chance to talk to and try to explain it to you all. I just love digging into the show and the characters. There's so much you can do with him, even if it's only theoretical. And then again, I could be completely wrong about all of this. This is just my interpretation of events, and if you have a completely different perception, feel free to challenge me about it, or just hold that to yourself and leave this video thinking I'm an idiot. I won't hold anything against you for that. You're entitled to have your own opinions about the matter, and I'm really just happy that I got to write this all down and share it with you. This is the first episode I have planned of the Bumblebee video bundle, or the BVB, which is going to be a sequence of Transformers videos vaguely related to the new movie coming out, just because there are a lot of Transformers related things that I want to get out, but I don't want to swamp you guys with Transformers 24/7 all the time. I promise that once this is all over, I'll go back to my regular videos, or maybe make one of these videos in between, but it really means a lot to me that you guys allow me to make the kind of content that I want, and just, that you continue supporting me and being cool. With that out of the way, as always, I'm a small channel, and it would mean a lot to me if you could like this video and consider subscribing. Every bit of support helps, if you have the time, of course, and feel free to check out my social medias or my Discord server in the description if you want to hang out and talk about all the latest memes and whatever. I'm cool and hip, and I know all the tubular internet references. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really appreciate you all. You're like a gentle leaf blowing on the autumn breeze. Be sure to have a nice day. Bye.